The stranger in room 204. It was a breezy Monday morning on the prestigious campus of Anders Hartman University, a small but elite institution nestled in the wooded hills of Northern California. The leaves danced across the stone paths between old brick buildings, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the whisper of the wind. Students hustled across the quad, books under arms, earbuds in, heading toward their next class, unaware that today would be different, unforgettable. Room 204 of the mathematics building, an austere classroom lined with chalkboards and windows that overlooked the green hills beyond, was already half full. The students gathered for MATV 401, Advanced Calculus and Abstract Mathematical Reasoning, a course known across campus not just for its brutal content, but for its merciless professor, Dr. Lawrence Prester. Dr. Prester was a man of towering intellect and equally towering ego, a former child prodigy and Fields Medal hopeful who fell just short of academia's highest honors. He had taught at Harvard, MIT, and had been published in journals most people couldn't even pronounce. But despite his credentials, Prester had a reputation. He didn't just teach mathematics, he dominated it, and anyone who entered his classroom did so at the risk of humiliation. He believed that learning required humility, and he dished it out like bitter medicine. This particular morning, as students shuffled in and took their seats, murmurs began to spread near the back row. Is that Keanu Reeves? No way. It can't be. What would Keanu Reeves be doing in a calculus class? Seated near the window in the third row, wearing a modest gray hoodie, jeans, and a soft expression, was none other than Keanu Reeves. At first glance, some students thought it might be a doppelganger, but the more they looked, the clearer it became. The jawline, the kind, thoughtful eyes, that quiet demeanor. It was him. No cameras, no entourage, just a notebook and a pen. As Dr. Prester entered, his usual black coat billowing behind him, the room fell silent. He tossed his leather bag onto the desk and started scribbling integrals and theorems on the board with intense purpose. Then he turned, scanning the room with sharp, clinical eyes. "Welcome to MATH 401, he said, his voice like gravel dragged across stone. "Most of you won't survive this course. That's not an insult. That's just statistics." A few nervous chuckles. "I expect the utmost focus, punctuality, and discipline. If you are here thinking, this is a stepping stone to Wall Street glory or Silicon Valley tech dreams, get out now. This is real mathematics. And real mathematics has no mercy." Then he paused. His eyes landed on Keanu. A flicker of recognition, but only a flicker. "You. Yes, you. In the hoodie. I don't recall seeing your name on the roster." The class turned, all eyes on Keanu. He stood up calmly. "Hi, I'm auditing the course. Just here to learn." Prester narrowed his eyes. "Auditing? This is not a yoga class, Mr. Hoodie. This is advanced calculus. You're in the wrong room." A murmur rippled through the class, but Keanu just smiled softly. "I know it's not on the list. I'm not here for credit. Just knowledge." Prester scoffed. "And what's your background in mathematics, Mr. Reeves?" Keanu said, with no flair. Keanu Reeves. Now, even Prester blinked. "The actor." Keanu nodded. Prester leaned against the desk and crossed his arms. "And you want to audit my class? You've got the wrong building. Drama is 3 floors down." The class tensed. Some students shifted uncomfortably. A few held back laughs. But Keanu didn't flinch. "With respect, Professor, I'm here to learn. I've been studying independently for years. I'm passionate about math, especially calculus." Prester wasn't impressed. Anyone can be passionate about math. That doesn't mean you understand it. He pointed at the board, where a particularly brutal integral stood. "Solve this." Keanu looked at it. He didn't move right away. He simply observed the equation, letting his eyes trace the symbols like a musician reading sheet music. Then, without asking for permission, he walked to the board. Chalk in hand, he made a few quiet notes in the margin. Then, with elegant speed, he began solving the integral, using a non-traditional method, one that involved a subtle trick from multivariable calculus. The class watched, eyes widening. When he finished, he underlined the answer, placed the chalk back in the tray, and returned to his seat. Prester stared at the board. His expression changed, ever so slightly. Confusion, then realization, then irritation. "That's correct," he said flatly. The room buzzed. Prester cleared his throat. "Lucky guess. Let's move on." Keanu said nothing. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, just opened his notebook. But for the first time in decades, Dr. Lawrence Prester felt something he hadn't felt since his PhD defense, the sting of being surprised. A secret life. Over the next few weeks, Keanu attended every lecture. Always early, always respectful, never missed a class. Students began whispering stories about him, how he stayed late helping struggling classmates with their homework, how he'd show up in the library poring over differential topology and Laplace transforms, how he never once mentioned his fame. But there was more. What nobody knew, what even Prester didn't know, was that Keanu Reeves had once been a teenage math prodigy. Before acting, before The Matrix, before John Wick. When Keanu was just 16, growing up in Toronto, he had two passions: acting and mathematics. He devoured books on number theory, topology, and calculus like novels. He corresponded with retired professors through mail. He even published a small paper in a youth mathematics journal under a pseudonym. But life took him in a different direction. A dying mother, the need to support his family, auditions, roles, then the fame, the fortune, the chaos. Yet through it all, math remained his refuge, a silent language that never lied. Equations were eternal. Unlike scripts, they didn't change. They couldn't be rewritten. They just were. And now, in the autumn of his life, after years of giving to the world through film, he wanted to nourish something deep inside, something forgotten, something pure. So he came to Anders Hartman, quietly, humbly, to learn again. The challenge. One afternoon, after a particularly intense lecture on Fourier series, Dr. Prester slammed a thick notebook onto the desk. "I am assigning a challenge," he said. "An optional one." He looked directly at Keanu. "It's a problem unsolved in my 20 years of teaching. A theoretical extension of Green's theorem into a hyper-complex vector field involving fractal boundaries. If any of you manage to even approach a solution, I'll give you my personal library of mathematics texts and offer you a recommendation letter to any grad school on Earth." The class chuckled nervously. "It's unsolvable," one student whispered. But Keanu just took the handout with quiet grace. That night, he sat in the campus coffee shop, a steaming mug beside him, headphones in his ears, a pencil in hand. Hours passed, then days. By the following Monday, Keanu stood before the board again. This time, not just to solve a problem, but to present a paper. 10 pages, fully bound. A full theoretical proposal outlining a new way to approach the problem using fractal geometry and higher dimensional calculus. When Prester read it, he went silent. Then he looked at Keanu. "Who are you?" Keanu looked him in the eyes. "Just someone who never stopped loving math." The echoes of silence. For days after Keanu Reeves handed in that bound manuscript, the one that dared to challenge an unsolvable theorem, Dr. Lawrence Prester said nothing. He neither praised nor critiqued. He simply tucked it beneath a stack of research journals on his desk and carried on with his usual lectures, as if it never existed. But in truth, it consumed him. Each night, after the hallways emptied and the world outside his office darkened, he opened Keanu's paper under the low glow of his desk lamp and traced every equation, every lemma, every proof. It was not perfect, but it was brilliant. There were moments within the manuscript, elegant transitions between logical steps, intuitive leaps that most seasoned mathematicians would never attempt, that spoke not just of intelligence, but of wisdom, of feeling math rather than simply performing it. It was an art form. And that realization unnerved Prester more than anything. For decades, he had equated authority with correctness. His authority. He prided himself not only on knowing more than his students, but being more, sharper, colder, more disciplined, to be challenged, genuinely challenged, by someone who didn't even demand recognition. It left him reeling in quiet humiliation. So he said nothing, and in doing so, said everything. Meanwhile, Keanu continued to sit in the third row. Same seat, same humble demeanor. He never brought up the paper, never asked about it. Instead, he listened attentively, took meticulous notes, and gently helped peers who stayed after class looking lost and overwhelmed. There was something almost spiritual about the way he moved through the university, never in a rush, always present. Some students began describing him not just as the actor in our class, but the soul of it, a calming presence, a living contradiction, world famous, and yet utterly anonymous in the way he carried himself. But not everyone admired him. To some, particularly Dr. Prester's most loyal students, Keanu represented something dangerous, a threat to the established order, a man who defied the rules not with rebellion, but with radical humility. One such student, Cameron Wu, had been grooming himself to be Prester's protege for years. Top of every class, publishing early, ruthless with competition. To Cameron, the classroom wasn't a space of learning, it was a battleground. And Keanu Reeves. He was an intruder, a trespasser who hadn't earned his place. One afternoon after class, Cameron approached Keanu near the campus library. "You know," he said, arms crossed, "people like you don't usually last long in places like this." Keanu looked up, not angry, just curious. Places like this. Elite spaces. Academic spaces. You're a tourist here. You'll leave. They always do. Keanu smiled gently, the kind of smile that came from surviving too much to be rattled by words. "I'm not here to compete, Cameron. I'm here to learn. That's all." Cameron's jaw clenched. "You're wasting everyone's time." And he walked away. But that evening, as Keanu sat alone by the lake behind the university chapel, flipping through a 1960s reprint of Gödel, Escher, Bach, something unexpected happened. Dr. Prester approached. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, coat in hand, watching the golden sunset reflect off the still water. "I read your paper," he finally said, his voice low, more gravel than usual. Keanu looked up, but didn't interrupt. "There were insights in there I haven't considered. The use of fractal symmetry across multidimensional surfaces. It's unconventional, risky." Keanu gave a small nod. "Math should be brave sometimes." Prester stared into the horizon. "You know, when I was your age, actually, younger, I once challenged a senior professor during a conference in Prague, presented a proof that restructured his entire thesis. I was confident, certain." He paused. "He humiliated me, not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't, because he couldn't handle being outdone." Keanu didn't respond. He just let the silence be. Prester turned to him. "Do you know what that does to a person? To have their brilliance become their burden. It hardens you, turns you into stone. Not because you want to be, but because it's safer." There it was, a crack in the armor. Keanu closed his book. It doesn't have to be that way. Prester studied him for a moment. This man who had known unimaginable fame, and yet sought out the anonymity of a chalkboard, who still believed in growth despite already having the world's applause. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," he said. Keanu gave that same soft smile. "That's because I'm not trying to be." The days grew colder, the trees more bare. Autumn slipped into early winter, and the energy on campus shifted as finals approached. Students buried themselves in books, cafes filled with whispered formulas, and caffeine-stained note cards. And then came the final project. Dr. Prester announced it with typical flair. No rubric, no examples, just a challenge. Construct and prove an original theorem, he declared, or expand on an existing one in a way that reveals new insight. It must be mathematically sound and intellectually audacious. The room exhaled a collective groan, except for Keanu. He leaned forward slightly, eyes glinting with quiet excitement. This was what he had come for. But as he walked home that night, something stopped him. A small figure sat hunched on the edge of the steps leading up to the science building. It was Maya, a freshman who had barely kept up in class all semester. She was holding her head in her hands, tears quietly slipping through her fingers. Keanu sat beside her, careful not to startle her. "Long day?" he asked gently. She nodded, sniffled. "I'm not going to pass. I can't even understand the lectures anymore. Everyone's so far ahead. I shouldn't have taken this class." Keanu reached into his bag, pulled out a blank notebook, and set it in her lap. "Let's work through it together. From the beginning, one step at a time." Maya looked at him, confused. "Why would you help me? You're you." He chuckled. "Exactly. And I know what it's like to feel lost." They spent the next 3 hours going over derivatives and limits, integrals, and proofs. Keanu's explanations weren't just clear, they were compassionate. He didn't just teach the math. He listened to her fear. And by the end of the night, Maya left not with all the answers, but with the belief that she could find them. And for Keanu, that was the true beauty of mathematics. It wasn't about being the best. It was about bringing others with you. Back in his office, Dr. Prester stood before a framed photo of himself at age 27. Young, driven, full of fire and pride. A different man. A man he wasn't sure he still recognized. He thought about the student who had dared to learn not to compete, but to understand. Who had humbled him not with ego, but with grace. Who had reminded him of the reason he fell in love with math in the first place. Not for awards, not for prestige, but for wonder. And for the first time in years, Dr. Prester felt something stir deep within, a quiet, aching desire to change. The proof of humanity. The first snow came late that December, dusting the roofs of Anders Hartman University like powdered sugar on a forgotten cake. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, just as Keanu Reeves had arrived months earlier. Soft, steady, almost unnoticed until you realized the entire landscape had changed. Inside room 204, the once buzzing class had grown still with intensity. Students no longer looked to Dr. Prester with fear, but with a guarded curiosity. Because he, too, had started to change. Not in sweeping ways, not in grand gestures, but in smaller details. He now paused longer before responding to questions. He corrected mistakes without condescension. And for the first time anyone could remember, he had started to listen. Keanu, as always, remained in his third-row seat, notebook open, hand steady, face calm. But what nobody could see was the quiet storm that had begun to swirl inside him. A gentle conflict between the love he felt for mathematics and the memories that sometimes haunted its edges. You see, years before the fame, before the Matrix, before the red carpets and paparazzi, Keanu's earliest connection to numbers came not from books, but from his father. A man of intense intellect and fractured spirit. A man who once taught Keanu how to find the volume of a sphere using nothing but a stick in the sand and shadows on the beach. A man who would later vanish from his life without explanation, leaving behind only silence and the memory of how numbers had once brought them close. Keanu never talked about it. Not with classmates, not even with himself. But as he worked late into the night on his final theorem for Dr. Prester's class, an ambitious proposal exploring entropy and infinite limits within non-Euclidean systems, those memories surfaced like whispers in the back of his mind. He wasn't just solving problems anymore. He was trying to finish a conversation that had never been allowed to end. One afternoon, as the snow deepened and the hallways emptied before winter break, Keanu found himself walking past the university's old planetarium. Its dome was dusted with frost, and the doors hung open just slightly, as though inviting someone in. Curious, he stepped inside. To his surprise, he wasn't alone. Dr. Prester was seated in the front row of the darkened dome, staring up at a projection of star maps and celestial trajectories. He didn't acknowledge Keanu at first. Didn't have to. "I used to want to be an astrophysicist," Prester said without turning. "Before I discovered mathematics." Keanu stood silently, letting the words come. There was something poetic about it. The idea that you could predict the motion of stars, entire galaxies, with a few lines of equations, like writing music for the universe. Finally, he looked at Keanu. "But then I realized I didn't love the stars. I loved the control, the certainty. I loved how numbers obeyed me. That was my downfall. That's where I became this." Keanu sat beside him. "Maybe," he said gently, "you didn't fall. Maybe you just forgot that math isn't about control. It's about connection." Prester looked at him with something between sorrow and awe. "How can a man who's been through what you've been through still believe that?" Keanu took a deep breath. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because even when life feels like it's unraveling, math reminds me that everything still fits somewhere. Even the broken pieces." For a long time, neither of them spoke, just the slow swirl of stars above them, like time itself pausing to let them breathe. When the day of the final presentations arrived, a quiet anticipation settled over the lecture hall. It wasn't just another academic showcase. For many students, it felt like the end of a journey that had reshaped their understanding, not just of calculus, but of themselves. Maya, the once overwhelmed freshman, stood confidently before the class and explained her elegant, if simple, exploration of wave equations. Cameron Wu, ambitious and sharp, presented a highly technical paper with the polish of someone born for podiums. But it was different now, less about defeating, more about sharing. Keanu's influence had softened even the hardest hearts. And then it was his turn. He walked to the front without papers or notes, just a piece of chalk in his hand and a lifetime in his eyes. "I didn't come here to impress anyone," Keanu began, "or to prove that I'm something I'm not. I came here to remember who I was, who I am." He turned to the board and began sketching a series of equations, fluid, complex, and strangely beautiful. They weren't just numbers. They were a story, a narrative told through mathematics, a journey from chaos to symmetry, from disorder to harmony. He spoke as he worked. "This theorem isn't perfect. It's messy. It has gaps, just like life. But every mistake leads somewhere. Every detour adds depth, and when you step back far enough, you see that even the imperfections form part of the design." When he finished, the board was filled from edge to edge with equations, graphs, and visual metaphors. It looked like a cathedral of logic, imperfect and majestic. The class sat in stunned silence. Not because it was the most complex project they'd seen, but because it was the most human. After class, Dr. Prester approached him. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, holding the copy of Keanu's paper in both hands like it was something sacred. "This," he said finally, "this isn't just mathematics. It's philosophy. It's grief. It's healing." Keanu shrugged. "It's my life. In numbers." Prester looked away, then back again. "I'm sorry," he said. Keanu tilted his head. "For what?" "For being afraid of you, of what you represent. For treating your brilliance like a threat when it was really a gift." Keanu reached out and gently patted the older man's shoulder. "Fear's just another variable," he said with a smile. "We all carry it. What matters is how we balance the equation." Prester laughed, an honest, full laugh that students would talk about for years to come. And in that moment, A lifetime of pride cracked open to let light in. Keanu Reeves left Anders Hartman University shortly after winter break. He didn't make a speech, didn't sign autographs. He just quietly disappeared, like the snow that melted into spring. But the impact he left behind became legend. Dr. Prester started a new program the following semester, one focused on collaborative learning, compassion in academia, and mentorship. He called it the Reeves Initiative, though no one ever publicly confirmed why. Maya graduated with honors 3 years later and became a math educator, citing a quiet stranger who believed in her as her biggest influence. And Cameron Wu. He went on to MIT, not just as a student, but as someone who'd learned the difference between intellect and wisdom. His first published paper was dedicated to the man who reminded me that humility is the highest form of genius. Keanu never spoke publicly about his time at the university. But sometimes, in interviews, when asked about the happiest moments of his life, he'd smile faintly and say that there was a little classroom, somewhere in Northern California, where I remembered how much I loved the quiet beauty of math. And that was enough. Because the truest transformations don't shout. They whisper. And the greatest teachers often arrive not to be seen, but to help others see. The ripple in the chalk dust. It had been 3 months since the snow had melted on the red brick paths of Anders Hartman University, but something in room 204 still carried the echo of winter. Not in temperature, but in feeling. As if the silence left behind by a quiet figure in the third row hadn't entirely lifted. The desk where Keanu once sat remained unclaimed, not because students were avoiding it, but because something unspoken kept them from filling that space. It had become a kind of shrine, unintentional yet sacred, a place where the presence of humility and brilliance once converged. Dr. Prester now stood at the front of the class, not with his usual crisp posture and booming voice, but with something more rare, gentleness. His once imposing demeanor had softened. He had shed the armor of superiority and stepped, finally, into the role of a guide, rather than a gatekeeper. He began his lectures now not with warnings, but with stories. Mathematics, he said to his new class on the first day, is not about proving how clever you are. It's about discovering how beautiful the world can be when you stop trying to control it. The students blinked in surprise. This wasn't the infamous Prester they had read about online. This was someone different, rebuilt, rewired. And though he never said Keanu's name, everyone in that room knew who he meant when he referred to the one who showed me how to listen. Far from campus, across coasts and cities, Keanu had returned to the rhythm of his life. He walked anonymous among crowds, blending into cafes and bookstores, taking trains instead of limousines. But something inside him had shifted permanently. The experience in that small classroom hadn't just rekindled his love for numbers. It had reconnected him to something deeper. His purpose wasn't to be seen. It was to see. To notice the lost, the overlooked, the discouraged, and remind them of their light. And so, quietly, without announcement, Keanu began a new chapter of silent giving. He started visiting underfunded schools under a false name, slipped into night classes at community colleges, sat in the back of GED programs, and offered help, not as a celebrity, not even as a guest speaker, but as a fellow student, a quiet presence who stayed late after class and asked more questions than he answered. And wherever he went, something began to bloom. Not because of who he was, but because of how he made people feel. Back at Anders Hartman, Maya now worked as a peer mentor in the university's math support program. She'd become the go-to for struggling students, not because she was the most gifted, but because she understood the weight of self-doubt. She would tell them the story of a man who once sat beside her on a staircase and taught her to breathe through the fear of failure, without ever revealing who he really was. She had never told anyone the truth, not even Dr. Prester. It was something she kept for herself, a treasure, a memory too sacred for spectacle. But it drove everything she did. She had begun developing a new program, Math for the Misunderstood, which combined calculus fundamentals with emotional support and mentorship. It was radical. It was deeply human. And when the university board questioned the direction, Dr. Prester stood by her and said, "Let it happen. This is where math begins to matter." Elsewhere, in a glass tower in Boston, Cameron Wu was now an associate researcher in an elite lab, but something in him had cracked open. Gone was the rigid pursuit of perfection. In its place, a deep curiosity for the why, not just the how. In his free time, he'd started writing a series of essays, personal ones, on mathematics and identity, on ego and failure, and the invisible kindness of unexpected mentors. One evening, while hosting a talk at a university panel, a student asked him, "What's the most important lesson you've ever learned in your field?" He paused, thought deeply, and replied, "That the most brilliant person I ever met never asked to be noticed. He just wanted to learn. And in doing that, he taught everyone else what brilliance really looks like." He left the name out, but everyone in the room heard it anyway. Meanwhile, Keanu's travels brought him to a small library in rural Oregon, where he was invited to speak at a quiet community center about storytelling and philosophy. During the Q&A, an elderly woman asked, "Do you ever wish you'd done something else with your life?" He thought for a moment. Then he said, "No, because every life I've lived inside the roles I've played has made me more curious. But if I weren't an actor, I think I'd be a math teacher." Laughter. Then he added, softer, "Not to solve problems, but to help people realize they're not problems themselves." Silence fell over the room. A gentle hush. One of those moments where you realize you've just witnessed something real. And later, after the lights were off and the chairs were stacked, he lingered behind, helping the janitor clean up spilled coffee. Because that's who he was. Not an icon, not a genius, just a man who believed in showing up. Quietly. Completely. Back at Anders Hartman, the story of the mysterious math genius who once solved an impossible theorem had become legend. Rumors ran wild. Some said he was a retired professor. Others thought he was a reclusive billionaire. A few suspected the truth, but no one ever confirmed it. Because Keanu never came back for recognition, only for redemption. And in his absence, the culture had changed. Professors began sharing office hours instead of walls. Students tutored one another not to compete, but to collaborate. And every time someone struggled with a problem and said, "I'm not smart enough for this," someone nearby would reply, "There was once a guy in this room who said the same thing before he changed everything." And so, the ripple spread. Not in viral clips or awards or press releases, but in chalk dust on fingertips, in handwritten notebooks passed between students, in tears dried beside textbooks at midnight. Keanu's legacy became a presence more than a person, a quiet force that reminded people that learning isn't a performance, it's an act of courage. And for Dr. Prester, now older and finally at peace with what he had once feared, it became a second chance. One morning, as he entered room 204, he found something sitting on the desk in the third row. A small folded note. No name, no flourish. Just 6 words. "Thank you for letting me learn." He sat down in that chair and smiled. For once, he didn't need to solve anything. He just let himself feel it. The equation beyond the board. Spring broke over Anders Hartman University, like a secret finally spoken aloud. The trees, once bare and brittle, now bloomed with soft pinks and bright greens, painting the campus in new life. The benches outside room 204 were warm again. The chalk dust no longer clung to heavy coats, but floated freely through open windows, like ideas finding places to land. Inside the classroom, Dr. Prester stood before a group of first-year students, now more mentor than monarch. He no longer lectured from a pedestal, but moved through the aisles as he taught, asking questions, inviting curiosity. The chalkboard behind him was less battlefield, more conversation. But today was different. Today, he set down the chalk and turned to the class with something softer in his eyes. "I want to tell you a story," he said. The room hushed, pens lowered. "Once," he began, "a man walked into this classroom who wasn't on the roster. He wasn't seeking a degree. He wasn't looking for recognition. He didn't even tell anyone who he was. He just came to learn." He paced slowly, letting the memory carry him. "At first, I thought he was wasting my time. I thought he didn't belong. But then, he solved a problem no one else could. Not because he was trying to impress us, but because he saw beauty where the rest of us saw difficulty." He paused, swallowing something in his throat. "He changed me. Not with arguments or ego, but with kindness, with presence, with a love for learning so pure, it forced the rest of us to remember why we ever picked up a piece of chalk in the first place." No one said a word. "And now," Prester said, straightening up, "I'd like to honor him by asking each of you to not just solve problems this semester, but to notice who's sitting beside you, to ask them if they're okay, to share your understanding. Because the greatest mathematicians are not those who master the hardest formulas, but those who help others understand them, too." A few students blinked, their pens frozen mid-sentence. They didn't know the man's name. But in that moment, they all felt him. Miles away, in a dimly lit room lined with books and quiet jazz humming from an old speaker, Keanu Reeves sat cross-legged on a cushion, his fingers moving slowly over the pages of a faded notebook. Not a script, not a contract, but a notebook of unfinished theorems, poetic scribbles in the margins, and diagrams that looked more like art than equations. He had been quiet for a while. After leaving Anders Hartman, he'd stepped back from everything: interviews, films, the public eye. Not in retreat, but in reflection. There was something sacred in stillness that fame had never allowed him to explore. His days now followed a rhythm not set by alarms or call sheets, but by wonder. He'd wake at dawn, meditate, walk to a nearby high school and volunteer, never in front of the class, but quietly in the background, helping one student with fractions, another with geometric proofs, a third with the courage to raise their hand. He no longer sought applause, only connection. But that morning, a letter arrived. No return address, just a simple university crest and a seal on the envelope. He opened it gently, unfolding the single sheet inside. "Dr. Lawrence Prester cordially invites you to speak at the inaugural Learning Without Ego Symposium, hosted in your honor." Below, a handwritten note. "I don't know if you'll come. I don't expect you to. But if you do, it would mean everything to the students you inspired, and to the teacher you unknowingly saved." Keanu stared at the page for a long time. Then he looked out the window where the morning light spilled across his floor like golden water. He didn't need to decide right away. He just needed to listen to what the silence was saying. Back at Anders Hartman, the symposium buzzed with nervous anticipation. Flyers with the words "Learning Without Ego" were pinned across campus, alongside quiet whispers from students who had heard legends of a mysterious genius who once sat among them. Dr. Prester, now fully transformed from skeptic to steward, stood at the entrance of the hall, greeting guests with a softness that seemed to surprise even him. Professors from other institutions arrived, curious. Alumni returned, eager to honor the story that had reshaped the school's identity. But still, no Keanu. The clock struck 7. Prester walked to the stage. He looked out at the packed auditorium and smiled. "I want to start by telling you what this night isn't," he said. "It isn't about prestige, or status, or who has the most degrees on the wall. This night is about a reminder of what learning was always meant to be, an invitation to grow, together." He paused. "And tonight, I had hoped a friend might join us. Someone who walked into my classroom with nothing but a notebook and a hunger to understand. Someone who never once asked to be seen, but who left behind a light none of us can forget." The audience listened closely, breath held. "I don't know if he'll arrive. And that's okay, because maybe the point was never for him to be here in person, but for us to carry forward what he taught us. Just then, a quiet murmur from the back. A figure stepped into the light, wearing a black blazer over a t-shirt, jeans, kind eyes. Familiar walk. Keanu Reeves. No fanfare, no announcement, just a soft wave and a humble smile. The room stood, not in the frenzy of celebrity, but in the reverence of someone who had come home. Keanu took the mic, not like a star, but like a student, grateful, reverent. "I don't have a speech," he said, chuckling softly. "I never do." Laughter, gentle, loving. "I just want to say, thank you for letting me be part of your story, and for reminding me that brilliance isn't about how many problems you can solve, but about how deeply you can care while solving them." Silence followed. The good kind, the kind that holds weight. "I once walked into a room just hoping to learn," he said, "and I walked out realizing I'd been teaching without even knowing it." He looked at Prester. They nodded. No more needed to be said. The night ended with students gathering in circles, sharing their own stories, not about Keanu, but about the people who had helped them, sat beside them, lifted them. A new kind of academic culture had bloomed, one that honored the invisible hands that guide us through difficult terrain. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Keanu stood quietly, a paper cup of coffee in hand, listening to a freshman explain her theory on chaos mathematics. He nodded, fully present, as if she were the only person in the room. Because in his eyes, she was. The final variable. The spring night wrapped around Anders Hartman University like a soft memory, warm and just a little bittersweet. Outside the symposium hall, the lanterns flickered gently in the breeze, casting shadows that swayed across the ivy-covered walls. It was a perfect evening, quiet, thoughtful, reflective. The kind of night that didn't want to be loud. It only wanted to be remembered. Inside, the energy was different, calmer now. The speeches were done. The chairs had been pushed aside, replaced by soft conversations and spontaneous laughter. It wasn't a celebration of intellect. It was a celebration of humanity, of what learning could look like when stripped of ego, pressure, and fear. Keanu Reeves stood by a tall window at the far edge of the room, the stars just beginning to reveal themselves in the darkening sky. In one hand, a cup of tea. In the other, a small notebook, dog-eared, worn, and full of scribbled thoughts from the past few months. Equations, sketches, quotes he'd heard students say. It had become more than a notebook. It was a journal of witnessing, not just the learning of math, but the healing of people. A soft voice broke his focus. "You ready to go?" Dr. Prester asked, his tone no longer formal, but familiar, friendly. Keanu smiled. "Not yet. I'm still absorbing." They stood in silence for a moment, two men changed by the same journey, but in different directions. "You know," Prester said, "I spent decades thinking my value came from being the smartest person in the room." Keanu nodded. "I think a lot of people do. But now," Prester continued, "I think our real value is measured by what we leave behind, not in the minds we impress, but in the hearts we touch." Keanu looked at him, his gaze soft. "Then you're richer than you think." Prester laughed, a real one, unburdened and full. He extended his hand. Keanu took it, but didn't shake. He just held it there, as if passing something invisible between them. Gratitude, forgiveness, closure. Weeks passed. The university slowly returned to routine. Exams came and went. Students rushed across campus again, earbuds in, coffee in hand, lost in the whirl of deadlines and dreams. But something subtle had changed. A warmth lingered where once there was only cold ambition. And the third-row desk in room 204, it remained empty. Not because it had been forgotten, but because it had become sacred. A space that reminded everyone that learning is not reserved for the brilliant, but for the brave. Elsewhere, Keanu disappeared again, not into retreat, but into intentional obscurity. He declined interviews, skipped red carpets. He traveled lightly, moving from town to town, not to be noticed, but to notice. He sat in diners at 6 a.m., scribbling notes on napkins. He volunteered at after-school programs under a pseudonym, teaching kids the joy of discovering patterns in numbers. He visited prisons, where he gave quiet talks to inmates about the beauty of second chances, explaining how math, like life, could sometimes feel impossible until you saw the next step. He never said his full name. He never asked for thanks. He just kept showing up. Because for him, this was the role he had waited his whole life to play. Not the hero in an action film, not the misunderstood loner on screen, but the ordinary man who made other people believe they were extraordinary. Years later, a new professor at Anders Hartman, once a failing student named Maya, stood before her own class. On the first day, she pointed to the third row. Someone once sat there who changed how we understand what this room is for. Not to compete, not to impress, but to grow, together. She let that settle. Then she smiled. And today, we begin again. Somewhere in a quiet library, in a town with no movie theaters, a janitor pushed his cart down the aisle and found a man sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by math books and notebooks. Closing soon, the janitor said kindly. The man looked up, graying hair, gentle eyes, a face the world once knew and forgot again. He nodded and stood slowly, gathering his things. As he walked out, the janitor asked, "You a teacher or something?" Keanu smiled, thought about it. Something like that. And he walked into the night. Because the greatest stories are not told at podiums. They are lived quietly, in classrooms, in notebooks, in conversations at the edge of doubt. And sometimes, a man sits in the third row and reminds the world that you don't have to speak loudly to be heard, that brilliance is not brightness, but light shared, and that the most powerful kind of genius is the kind that leaves everyone else believing they're capable of it too.